This story is about alien students who link minds with a human and immediately spiral into panic, trauma, and chaos. It started with a flyer stapled to the trunk of a chlorophyll-wrapped announcement pillar on campus. Multispatial Empathy Workshop, Mind Link for Academic Harmony. Neatly printed in all 9 dominant campus languages, it was the kind of thing that would have been laughed off on Earth as either cultish or corporate. But this was Arcadia 9 University, a place where laughter had to be explained, or with annotated diagrams. Still, the turnout was huge. The Empathy Workshop was hosted in Auditorium V, a bioreactive dome that reshaped its interior to fit any guest's neuro-optical comfort. Luminescent vines pulsed with soft rhythm, scent vapors adjusted by species, and ambient tones suggested tranquility with aggressive enthusiasm. Jason Campbell, the only human in Advanced Xenopsychology 401, had no idea what to expect. He'd signed up partly out of boredom, partly because his professor, Lecturac Soon, had guilted him into it by asking how humans ever survived with such isolated minds. He was used to being a novelty in class. His involuntary eye twitch, obsessive note scribbling, and stubborn insistence on daily caffeine cycles had already made him something of a living exhibit. 12 alien students had formed a wide arc around him. Their varying physiologies made symmetry impossible, but they all exuded a similar, if hesitant, interest. The exercise was simple. Open minds to the group via a surface link protocol, guided by the instructor, no forced depth reads, only what naturally rises. The link initiated with a barely perceptible shimmer in the air. One by one, the students fed in their presence. Arful with its fluid empathy, Thakai and her structured emotional lattice, Vec of the void-skinned thinkers whose minds reflected thoughts like prisms. They all melded, harmonizing like instruments tuning before a concert. Jason had not joined yet. He sat at the edge of the circle, instructed to wait while the rest established cohesion. The link buzzed faintly around him like a plasma storm behind a curtain. "Harmless," the professor said. That's when the screaming started. It began with a gasp from Arfel, whose bioluminescent markings flared deep crimson. A split second later, Thakai stiffened and collapsed sideways, limbs twitching in distress. Vec emitted a high-pitched frequency that cracked 2 wall panels. Within 10 seconds, the entire ring of alien students had collapsed, several vomiting biofluids, others cradling their heads, some shrieking in tones that triggered the room's emergency silence dampeners. Jason hadn't moved. He blinked, heart pounding in confusion. "What the hell?" he muttered. Professor Sune was on the floor, gripping the sides of his head, antennae rigid and twitching erratically. It took a full 3 minutes for medical drones to arrive, and by then 3 students had to be sedated. Jason stood awkwardly as a security field snapped on around him, and the auditorium's interface began babbling in 6 languages at once. He hadn't even entered the link. The attending medic, a Lotaran named Kresh, pulled Jason aside. "You did not attempt the merge?" "No. I was waiting for the instructor's cue." "Impossible," Kresh said, scanning him. "They accessed something." Jason's palms began to sweat. "What did they see?" "We do not know. It appears to have been surface noise, your uncontrolled baseline thought radiation, like mental static." Kresh stared at him, as though he were a malfunctioning nuclear core. The aftermath unfolded fast. The university issued an immediate ban on all telepathic interactions near humans, effective campus-wide. Counselors were deployed to every dorm cluster housing the affected aliens. Emotional residue lingered on walls like psychic mold, requiring sterilization. A week-long morning fog was triggered in the air filtration system by mistake. Jason was quarantined for 3 days, then released with a stress ball and pamphlet titled Cultural Neurodivergence in Sol 3 Primates. The worst part? None of the affected students remembered what they'd seen in detail, only impressions. There was a small creature, one said through tears. Not dead, but bagged. Then fried. For flavor, there was a loop of pain, purposeful, like training. They did it to themselves. There was rhythmic slamming of skulls against other skulls on green fields for entertainment. One student simply sobbed, muttering, "Taxes," over and over. The university held a closed session hearing. Professor Soon, once recovered enough to speak, refused to elaborate, then stopped speaking altogether. His lecture appointments were quietly canceled. Rumors swirled that he'd gone to live among the speechless monks of Trevar 6. Jason kept his head down. For the first time, his novelty status turned to notoriety. Students averted their eyes in hallways. Some left fruit offerings by his door, though he wasn't sure if they were meant as tribute or containment. Weeks passed. Jason resumed class, now attended remotely by most of his peers. He sat alone in lecture pods, surrounded by empty seats. Then, one morning, a soft chime woke him at 6 a.m. An internal university memo had gone viral. A researcher had secretly attempted a depth read of Jason's actual thoughts, bypassing the empathy ban under clinical exemption. The report simply ended with a single line: "Subject accessed. No words remain." The researcher, a highly decorated psionics scholar of the Zevalon order, had abandoned his lab, left his possessions, and walked silently into the tundric ocean. His neural trace disappeared 20 meters offshore. Jason, now sipping instant coffee from a mug labeled "World's Okayest Student," checked his messages. Over 24 invitations from research departments. Half wanted to study him, the other half wanted to ban him. He replied to none of them. By the start of the new semester, Jason Campbell had earned a nickname behind his back: the Echo. It wasn't affectionate. The moniker spread from whispered corners of the linguistics commons to late-night biocafes and interspecies meme channels. No one used it to his face. They didn't need to. Jason could feel it in the way conversations dimmed when he entered a room, in the nervous glances exchanged over his shoulder, in the unmistakable deference with which even professors now addressed him. What none of them knew, what none of them asked, was how the entire event had affected him. Jason hadn't slept properly since the mind link, not because of guilt, he still didn't know what they'd seen, but because, after that day, his own thoughts felt louder, noisier. Sometimes, when he tried to focus, they tangled into images he couldn't explain. His father's cracked hands on a rusted wrench, the stench of overcooked ramen in a dorm microwave, the day he fell off his childhood bike and didn't cry until bedtime. Fragments, flashes, things no one should scream about. He found himself avoiding reflective surfaces, then avoiding people altogether. His advisor recommended mindfulness. His roommates switched rooms without explanation. Then came the interview. Dr. Zelshara, a cognitive ethnologist from the remote research planet Halcyon V, had applied for special clearance to conduct what she called a soft session. No psionics, no scans, no links. Just conversation. She was known for her work among extreme neural variant species, including the sensory-imploded coral mines of the Cortu Reef and the dream-locked Oitin spores. If anyone had a hope of understanding him, it was her. Jason agreed. They met in a neutral space, a transparent sphere suspended above Arcadia 9's gravity garden. No exits, no electronic interference, no way for either of them to run. She arrived punctual, encased in a suit that pulsed gently with bioluminescence, calibrated to his emotional state. It dimmed immediately upon entry. "I'm not here to scan you, Jason," she said, her voice like soft rain on metal. "I just want to listen." Jason nodded, but he didn't speak. So she started with questions. What did he remember from the incident? What did he think they saw? What were his childhood routines like? Had he ever lost someone close? Had he ever been forced to adapt rapidly, without support? Jason's first answer came an hour later, a whisper. "My mom got cancer when I was 15. My dad worked doubles to pay for the treatments. I stopped going to the movies." Zelshara paused, eyes narrowing gently. "That would not be considered traumatic by your medical reports." "No," Jason said. "But it's what came up, that's the problem. It's not what we think matters, it's what we feel while we're thinking it." She nodded slowly and asked for more. The mundane crept in, the dread of unfinished homework, the humiliation of wearing hand-me-downs, the thrill of using sarcasm to dodge vulnerability. He spoke of winter days without heating and the joy of stealing blankets from the family dog, of friends he didn't quite trust and holidays wrapped in politeness and tension. Dr. Zelshara listened, didn't interrupt. After 2 hours, she sat back and said, "It's like standing under a waterfall made of razors and song." Jason frowned. "That's not poetic, that's just weird." "Exactly," she said, smiling, "which is why no one was ready for it." The next day, she published a classified summary. Human surface cognition is not a stream. It is a compression chamber. Sentient memory intertwined with emotion, insecurity, fantasy, and absurdity, cycling continuously. The damage from passive exposure is not from horror, but from contextual overload. Their minds never stop trying to mean something. Within days, it was leaked. Within a week, students formed an advocacy group lobbying to classify humans as emotionally radioactive species. Jason, meanwhile, was attending his mandatory neural regulation seminar in the annex behind the bioethics tower. It was run by an ancient cephalorian named Vus, whose gelatinous exterior jiggled disapprovingly whenever Jason asked questions. "This is not about you expressing your humanity," Vus would intone, voice thick as molasses. "It is about you learning to contain it." But Jason was trying. He practiced thought-dampening drills, focus redirection, breathing into non-anxious mindsets. He even wore a Psi muffler headband in public, which made him look like a sleep-deprived tennis coach. Still, it wasn't enough. Because more had tried to read him. Not officially, not with permissions. Some did it out of arrogance, others curiosity. But one by one, reports filtered in. Nightmares, disassociations, mental lockouts. A food delivery drone found a student from the Faculty of Neuronaface floating in the ornamental koi pond whispering, "Frozen burrito aisle," with glassy eyes. It was getting worse. So the university escalated. They brought in a tribunal, a council of 9 cross-species minds tasked with investigating whether Jason's presence violated interspecies safety codes. They didn't ask him to attend. They reviewed case files, psychological fragments, drone footage, and then made their ruling. Jason would be allowed to stay, but he must agree to voluntary containment protocols during all public movement and interactions. He now had to wear a thought suppressor vest, monitored by an AI nicknamed Calm Jack. His dorm was relocated to a shielded zone near the recycling compound. All group projects were now single-participant substitutions. He wasn't banned, he was just boxed. And still, they hadn't accessed his actual thoughts. Because Jason had never tried. He couldn't. He was terrified of what he'd see himself. Late one evening, in the still humming quiet of the isolation zone, Jason sat cross-legged on his bed, Psi vest powered down for maintenance. He stared at a notebook he hadn't touched in weeks. Flipping to a blank page, he began to write not in words, but in tiny drawings. Cartoon memories, faces, moments, coffee cups, fists, a broken phone, a dog that looked like an old slipper, a cracked Game Boy, a mother's hand brushing his hair before chemo. Her lips moving but no sound coming out. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he just kept drawing. And for the first time in weeks, the noise in his mind quieted. He hadn't healed, he hadn't forgiven the world, but for a brief moment, Jason Campbell wasn't a weapon or a warning. He was just a man, remembering. Jason's containment protocols became routine, the way a limp becomes a part of walking. Comjack chirped reminders in a soothing Midwest accent. Deep breath, you're doing great, champ, whenever his thought signatures spiked above recommended thresholds. It had been calibrated by someone who assumed humans liked sports metaphors and casual paternalism. They weren't wrong, exactly, just wrong for Jason. He rarely spoke during class anymore. Most sessions had shifted to asynchronous recordings, uploaded into his neural inbox. When he did attend in person under escort, his vest hummed like a distant generator. Conversations paused when he entered, not from fear, but discomfort. The silence of people who didn't want to be the next cautionary tale. And yet, life outside Jason continued with its usual bureaucratic absurdity. The university launched a human cultural integration office, which consisted of one confused intern and a holographic duck that told jokes about cheese. A student-led initiative introduced human empathy helmets, wearable devices that filtered Jason's brainwaves into soothing animal imagery. They worked briefly, until someone's helmet showed a snarling raccoon on a throne of spaghetti and caused a mass panic during lunch hour. Jason kept his distance, but then came the message. A handwritten note, actual paper, folded and slipped beneath his door. No name, no stamp, just 4 words. You never even tried. The words rattled him, because they were true. Every student, professor, and telepath who'd experienced his mind had done so accidentally or through filtered glimpses. No one, not even Jason himself, had ever accessed his full, focused thought stream. The idea had always been out of bounds, a forbidden experiment. What if something broke? What if someone else walked into an ocean? And yet, part of him burned with curiosity. Was he really a danger, or just misunderstood? Jason decided he needed to know. He filed a formal request to attempt voluntary death link with a certified observer present. The application triggered 5 separate investigations, 2 campus-wide alerts, and a mandatory psychological reevaluation. But after 3 weeks of hearings and a signed waiver 23 pages long, the request was approved. The session was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the Psionics Lab Core Chamber 7, triple shielded. Only one participant was authorized to receive the stream, Professor Emeritus Tauren, a non-corporeal cognitive entity encased in a containment lattice. Tauren had voluntarily divorced from emotion centuries ago. He had no biological brain to traumatize. Ready when you are, came the flat projection. Jason sat in the center chair. Electrodes were attached to his temples. The vest deactivated. Calmjack went silent. Tauren's presence flowed in like a breeze with no source. Jason closed his eyes. The link activated, and everything changed. Tauren's containment lights pulsed violently as data flooded in, not coherent memories, not discrete images, but an unfiltered avalanche of Jason's lived reality. Childhood, not as a timeline, but as a texture of uncertainty. Adolescence encoded with humor and shame in equal measure. Late nights staring at ceilings, wondering if anything he said mattered. The sensation of being both invisible and too visible. Grief, love, embarrassment, fury. Moments Jason hadn't even known he remembered. The sting of ice cream on a bruised lip, the crack of laughter at a joke told too soon after a funeral. Music he couldn't name, but felt anyway. But beneath all that, deeper still, lay the core, a stubborn, quiet force of will. Not pride, not arrogance, just endurance. Jason's mind wasn't a threat because it sought to harm. It was a problem because it wouldn't break, not cleanly, not predictably. It adapted, it learned. It carried wounds the way trees carry rings. Tauren said nothing. The lights in his lattice blinked once, then dimmed. The session ended. The next morning, the professor's unit was found untouched. No movement, no reaction, no sign of malfunction. He still hasn't spoken. The university halted all cognitive research involving humans indefinitely. Jason wasn't punished, but he wasn't celebrated either. He was offered a leave of absence, counseling, scholarships to attend programs back on Earth, but he refused. "I'm staying," he told the chancellor. "This is where I learn how to be part of your world, even if it means you don't like what I bring." The response was a long silence, and finally, a nod. A week later, new guidelines were issued. Telepathic protocols would resume for most species except humans, who were to be treated as cognitively non-linkable, similar to sentient black holes or time-variant entities. Jason received a certificate naming him Mentally Autonomous Representative of Earth. It was laminated. Still, things began to change, quietly. A Sarnathi student asked him to help translate Earth metaphors for a poetry assignment. A group of Kithlings requested access to Earth comedy after watching a clip from Seinfeld and laughing for 6 continuous minutes. A Tau Nil researcher invited Jason to co-author a paper titled Humor as Existential Armor, the Sol 3 Anomaly. Jason agreed. Slowly, he joined life again. Not because he was no longer feared, but because fear had become familiarity. And in that strange, sideways way, he was part of the ecosystem now. It had been nearly 3 months since the depth link session with Professor Tallren. His containment chamber remained sealed and quiet, a soft blue glow the only sign of his presence. University officials called it a voluntary meditative state, but everyone knew he hadn't come back. Jason had stopped checking the updates. Some parts of this place were going to stay broken. What hadn't broken, surprisingly, was him. The storm had passed, not in some triumphal, all-is-forgiven way, but more like the quiet after a brutal rainstorm, mud still thick, trees down, but light starting to poke through. Jason had stopped apologizing for existing, not defiantly, just practically. He'd begun auditing new classes, this time on interspecies storytelling, not as a subject of study, but as a contributor. His tales weren't always well received. The Makari hated stories without moral clarity. The Lycei couldn't comprehend punchlines, but some of them listened anyway. The first real sign that things were shifting came during an open seminar on memory preservation rituals. Dr. Velanth, an archivist species that wore their ancestral lines as tattoos etched into glassy skin, had invited students to share a culturally significant memory aloud. Jason didn't raise his hand, but a student across the room did. A Belkesha species known for eidetic telepathy stood up slowly. I would like to describe something I did not experience, but which now lives in my mind. Jason looked up. The Velkash paused, then began. There is a man, young, sitting on a hospital floor. He is holding a crumpled vending machine wrapper. His fingers are bleeding because the machine took his money and he hid it. He is trying not to cry. But the reason he is crying is not the machine. It is the room behind him. The woman inside is very sick. She told him a joke before he left. A very bad joke. But he laughed, because if he didn't laugh, he would scream. And now he can't stop thinking about the sound of that laugh, because it doesn't sound like him, it sounds too small. The room was silent. The air filtration paused, as if to listen better. Jason said nothing, just nodded, once. Later that day, he found a small package outside his dorm. Inside was a snack bar and a note. I know it's not the same machine, but you still deserve to win sometimes. There was no signature. Life didn't snap back into something comfortable. Some students still avoided eye contact. Some professors still marked his assignments too cautiously, as if afraid of setting something off. But others, one by one, stopped flinching. He found himself invited to group projects again. A Lycei peer asked to borrow his notes, and actually laughed at his doodles in the margins. The university quietly lifted the emotionally radioactive tag from his student record. He didn't celebrate. He just took a long walk through the gravity gardens and breathed without the Psi vest for the first time in days. Nothing exploded. A month later, Jason got a call from Earth. His younger sister, now studying art therapy, had sent him a short video, a clay animation she'd made for her final project. It was about him, a lone figure surrounded by strange, towering shapes. At first, the shapes loomed, but then, slowly, they turned, tilted, listened. One by one, they sat beside the figure. No dialogue, just motion. Jason watched it twice, then again. When it ended, he sat very still. The next day, he requested permission to lead a new student discussion group, Mixed Processing Dialogues, Surviving the Noise. It was approved without debate. He hosted the first session that Friday. Attendance was light. Only 7 students. 3 of them wore Psi mufflers, just in case. Jason opened with a question. What's something you thought no one would ever understand, but that still shaped who you are? The responses trickled in. A childhood fear of thunder, the ritual of boiling bark during a mourning season, the feeling of exile not from a place, but from a version of oneself. Jason didn't speak until the end. Then he told them about the vending machine. They laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was real. And sometimes, being real was enough. By the end of term, mixed processing dialogues had grown to 3 sessions a week. By mid-cycle, it was full. Jason didn't become a celebrity, no monuments, no medals, but he became something better. He became part of the story. And when the new alien students arrived next cycle, their orientation materials included a simple advisory. Human cognition operates differently. It is layered, erratic, and saturated with emotion. It is not to be feared, but it is to be respected. Do not link without consent. Do not assume comprehension. And above all, be ready to listen. There were no more screaming incidents. But every now and then, a curious student would find their way to Jason's office hours, nervous and wide-eyed. "Can I ask what it's like?" they'd say. And Jason would smile, offer them a chair, and say, "It's a lot, but it's worth it." Then he'd listen to their story too.